In October 1993, Secret of Mana was released for the Super Nintendo, and it was great. Its success launched a well-regarded franchise. The next game in the series would be Legend of Mana for the Sony PlayStation, at least as far as Western gamers were concerned. Legend of Mana was actually the fourth game in the Mana series, but it was only the second game to bear the Mana name. In Japan, it's known as the Seiken Densetsu series, which literally translated means Legend of the Holy Sword. Secret of Mana is known in Japan as Seiken Densetsu 2. A sequel was released for the Super Famicom, Seiken Densetsu 3, but unfortunately it was never released outside of Japan, so the only way to play it in English is to use an emulator. I highly recommend playing it if you have not, as it is an excellent game. But this video is about the first game in the Mana series, and it is extremely interesting to say the least. Squaresoft trademarked the name Seiken Densetsu in 1989 for a project they had worked on for the Famicom Disk System, a Japanese exclusive add-on for the Famicom that used special floppy disks rather than game cartridges. This game project was massive, and it was intended to span 5 FDS disks, more than any other game released at that time. Square took pre-orders for this version of the game, but the project was simply too ambitious and it was ultimately cancelled. Refunds were issued, but Square told their customers that they shouldn't be sad. They should look forward to an upcoming RPG from them, a game called Final Fantasy. In 1991, a team at Square had been working on a game for the Gameboy. It had the working title of Gemma Knights, but finally the name they trademarked 2 years earlier would get its first title, and Seiken Densetsu was released in Japan in June 1991. The game would also be released in the US in November of that year, but it was not called Seiken Densetsu, or Legend of the Holy Sword, or anything with the word Mana in the title. It was released as Final Fantasy Adventure. Yeah, there were actually 4 Final Fantasy games released for the Game Boy, and none of them are true Final Fantasy games. There are 3 games in the Final Fantasy Legends series, but these are actually the first games in the Saga series, which includes the romancing Saga games for the Super Famicom, as well as the 2 excellent Saga Frontier games for the PlayStation. I can't yet say why the early Saga games bore the Final Fantasy moniker, but I can explain it for Adventure. When Adventure was released, the Final Fantasy franchise was still very young. In the West, we had only had one Final Fantasy game, the very first. Final Fantasy II and III were released in Japan for the Famicom, and that was it. The 4th Final Fantasy game, known to us Westerners as Final Fantasy II on the Super Nintendo, would be released November 1991, the same month as Final Fantasy Adventure. This means that Adventure only had the first 3 games from which to draw references and inspiration. In fact, in Japan, the game's full title was Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden. Gaiden is a common term used in Japanese titles as it basically means side story. The first Seiken Densetsu game was intended to be a sort of expansion to the Final Fantasy universe, and so while it is not really a Final Fantasy game, it does have some interesting connections. But there's more to this naming scheme issue. Adventure had a 3rd name, as it was released in Europe as Mystic Quest. If that sounds familiar to you, that's because in 1992, Squaresoft would release a game for the Super Nintendo named Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, a unique game in the series, but one that is very nostalgic to me and one which I enjoy a lot. It was actually released in the US before it was released in Japan, where it was called Final Fantasy USA. And again, Europe decided it wanted to be special and released the game as Mystic Quest Legend. So to sum things up, there's Final Fantasy Adventure, Final Fantasy Legend, Mystic Quest, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, and Mystic Quest Legend. Yeah. Once your head has reassembled itself, we can get to talking about the game. As I said, Adventure was released for the Nintendo Game Boy in November 1991 here in the US. Apart from translating the game to English and changing the title screen, the game is identical to the Japanese version. I was pleasantly surprised with Adventure. That it was not a quote-unquote real Final Fantasy game was common knowledge by the mid-90s, so I avoided it as a kid, but that was a huge mistake. It is easy to see that this is a game in the Mana series, as the first line of the game's introduction references the Tree of Mana. The story in this game is actually quite good. The translation is not great as it is peppered with English, but as you play the game and pick up the pieces, it becomes enjoyable, and the story is well done for a portable game of the time. It doesn't pull any punches either. Within a few minutes you discover that you are a slave, fighting for the entertainment of an evil ruler known as Dark Lord. And after you defeat your first monster of the game, your best friend Willie dies in the cell you share. His dying words tell you to seek out a Gemma knight known as Bogard. Your fellow slaves tell you to escape through the monster pen, and after you defeat the second beast, you escape to outside the castle. It is here that you snoop on Dark Lord and his right man Julius, as they discuss their plans to access the Tree of Mana to steal its powers. They mention that a girl has the key to accessing the secret temple, and when you are discovered, you are pushed off a cliff to your doom. But you survive, of course, and you begin to wander around without much direction. You soon encounter a girl being attacked by monsters. They've killed her companion, and she is also looking to find Bogard, so you decide to travel together. When you first meet Bogard, he wants nothing to do with you, but after he sees the pendant around the girl's neck, he explains that that necklace is the pendant of Mana. He knew the woman who wore it previously when he was fighting the evil Vandal Empire as a much younger man, which was trying to use the power of Mana to take over the world. He tells the two of them to go see a man named Siba in the town of Wendell, and that is how your journey begins. Graphically, I find the game to be quite good. The world and dungeons themselves are not too special, but the enemies are well done, and there are many enemies here that appear in later Mana games, such as the Rabbites, the Mushrooms, the Flying Imps, the Goblins, and even the kickboxing werewolves. The character and NPC sprites are very Final Fantasy-like, and like later Mana games, Moogles make an appearance in Adventure as a status ailment. But unlike later Mana games, Adventure actually has chocobos. About a third of the way through the game, you must find and hatch a chocobo from an egg. Riding this chocobo allows you to move faster and makes you invincible, so it is very handy. As I said earlier, Final Fantasy II was released in the same month as Adventure in the US. This means that depending on the exact dates the game were released, this could be the very first game to show chocobos and Moogles to a Western audience. I also have to say that the music in this game is great. The main overworld theme is very nice and memorable, although you will be hearing it through most of the game, so you may still become tired of it. A lot of the music is reminiscent of the first Final Fantasy game, especially the town music. You definitely won't have any complaints about the audio in this game, it's all well done. On its face, Adventure looks and plays very much like the first Zelda game or Link's Awakening for the Game Boy, but it has many more RPG elements as well as features that would become staples of the Mana series. Like the original Zelda, each screen is independent, and you defeat enemies with your sword. But you will acquire many different weapons, and most of them are required to access different areas. Axes can chop down trees, chains let you cross gaps, and the Morning Star breaks open walls and other destructibles. Some weapons can be found in chests or as rewards for defeating bosses, but the rest can be purchased from the now familiar dancing Arabian merchants. Having a large selection of weapons is common in the Mana series, but it is somewhat of an annoyance in Adventure because many enemies are immune to damage from certain weapons. In addition to weapons, you also learn a few magic spells, although I only found a couple to be any good, the most useful being Cure, of course. The ice spell is necessary to complete several rather annoying puzzles in the game, and the nuke spell is fairly powerful. But for the majority of my game I only use the Cure spell, as the only ways to restore your MP in the field are to level up or use ethers. When you gain a level, you must select one of 4 stats to increase: power, stamina, wisdom, or will. When you select a stat to level up, its value increases by 2, and 2 other stats increase by 1. Power increases the damage you deal, stamina increases your HP and defense, wisdom increases your MP, and will increases the rate at which your weapon's special ability charges. I mostly focused on power and stamina for the beginning of the game, as healing items were cheap, but later in the game the Cure spell is much more effective, so it's definitely worth it to increase your wisdom too. You'll meet many other characters on your quest to stop the evil Dark Lord, and each of these companion characters offers certain benefits. Many will randomly wander the screen and attack enemies, but they're not too useful in that regard. Luckily, they are invincible, and you don't have to worry about them dying or leaving them behind when changing screens. What makes these companions wonderful is the Ask command from your main menu. Certain companions will perform something special when you use this command, and it never runs out. The girl you encounter at the beginning will heal you a percentage of your maximum health, which means this is probably the second best Ask command in the whole game. Adventure is an impressive game, but it does have its issues. The hit detection is not very good. Sometimes it can be difficult to tell whether you are actually hitting an enemy, and in the early parts of the game this can lead to many situations where you die simply because your attacks weren't damaging the monsters and they bumped into you. Some monsters also jump around quickly when hit, oftentimes right into you. Also, the only way to know if an enemy is immune to your weapon is to hear a certain sound effect when hitting it. But this same sound effect is used to detect breakable walls and for hitting non-destructible objects, and this can be very confusing. The game also has a lot of small annoyances. For one, there is no command to talk to NPCs. You simply walk into them to talk to them. It's efficient until an NPC is in your way, in which case you have no choice but to wait for them to move. Your main inventory is limited to 16 items, but the problem here is that most items only have a couple of uses. The Cure item only comes in packs of 2, for example, and you can't combine items. The only item that comes in large stacks is the Matok, which is a pickaxe used to break certain objects and hidden entrances and walls, like the bombs from Zelda. The first time you get the Matoks, they are a freebie from Bogard. I was deep in a dungeon when I ran out of Matoks, and I thought I had to return to him to get more. But after walking all the way back out of the dungeon, I stopped by a store to buy some more Cure items, and that's when I realized that the stores actually sold Matoks. You just have to hit down on the selection menu. The story in Adventure has many interesting twists and turns, though our hero dodges death a little too often, I think. The coolest aspect of Adventure to Final Fantasy fans is that not only is there a chocobo in this game, there's a chocobo cyborg named Chocobot. Chocobot is the same chocobo chick you hatched earlier in the game, but when you took a bad fall, he came to your rescue but was injured in the process. Some guy brings your chocobo back to health with a few enhancements. Chocobot allows you to travel over water, so this is no ordinary horse bird. I won't spoil the rest of the story for you for 2 reasons. 1. Final Fantasy Adventure is a fun game, and if you're old enough to have played original Game Boy games, then I think you'll find a good time in it. Apart from the limited inventory and the lack of extra buttons, the game doesn't suffer from problems with the menu, system, or controls the way some older games do. But the second reason is that this game received a remake in 2003, released in the US as Sword of Mana for the Game Boy Advance.